Their objection.
Mr. President,
The senator from Kentucky.
reserving the right to object, I think there are some interesting points when we look at our debt and we try to figure out how best to fix it. What we've been dealing with today is a spending bill of about 700 pages, but does deal with only what is called discretionary spending. This is military and non-military spending, and it's about a third of what we spend overall. The other 2/3 is called entitlement spending or mandatory spending. And so often people will say, well, we can't cut the discretionary spending because we're not doing anything to the 2/3 of spending that is mandatory. This is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps, and some welfare programs. And it is true that they're growing at a rapid rate. They're growing at about 6%, and then the military and the non-military growing at about 2%. So there is more of the problem on the entitlement side, but often you'll hear people come to the floor and they say, well, we can't, we've cut all this discretionary spending. What we really need to do is entitlement. And yet it's a bit of a canard because I've been here 6 years. I've tried to push entitlement reform, tried to push cost savings, and we've never had a bill come to the floor. So people say, oh, I'm not going to cut this, but if the other were to come to the floor, if mandatory spending cuts, well, how come nobody brings it to the floor? It never comes to the floor. So 2/3 of the budget or the spending is never being cut, and it's growing at 6%. It is a problem. Entitlements have to be contained. Some of the entitlement problem is really neither Republican nor Democrats' fault. It's basically a function of that we're living longer. So when Social Security was created, the average life expectancy was about 65 or less. Now the average life expectancy is about 80, so you can see how the costs have risen dramatically. We're living a lot longer. The other thing that happened somewhere along the way is when we were victorious in World War II, we came home, we had a lot of babies for one reason or another. The baby boomers, 60, 70 million of them, and they're retiring. So there's an enormous cost of retiring baby boomers, and we're living longer. And so these things have added to entitlement costs, and there are things we could do. I've recommended that we gradually raise the age of eligibility. And people say, oh, you don't want people to get their Social Security at 65. Well, it's already 67, actually. Or Medicare. The problem is if we leave things as is, Medicare is about $35 trillion short, and Social Security is about $7 trillion short. So you got $7 trillion short in Social Security and 35 in Medicare. You do have to do something about the entitlements. But, the same grievance I have for the process here is the same grievance I have for entitlement reform. I've been pushing for it for 6 years here. I've introduced bills that never get hearings. So the leadership on both sides, in fact, I've heard this before, they'll say, you can talk about it, but don't put it on paper. So many people are for entitlement reform until it comes to the specifics. You saw a little bit of this in the debate over Obamacare. Getting rid of any kind of entitlement or even lessening it or making it more cost effective, people freak out with that. So it is true, you have to look at entitlements. If we were to look at entitlements, it would take some pressure off of military spending. But I think it's also important with military spending to put it in perspective. We have doubled military spending since 9/11, 2001. We put a lot of money into the military. And then there's a question of what is national defense? Is defense having weapons to defend ourselves against attack, having troops and armaments and being able to defend and occasionally go to where the attackers are? Or is the job of the military to be involved in every civil war around the world? Currently, we're involved in at least 7 different wars. None of them have been voted on. Our founding fathers said that the executive branch was the most prone to war, and therefore they gave that power to Congress. And yet we haven't voted on any of the 7 wars we're involved with. 7 different wars around, at least. There have been people talking about authorizing war, and they want us to be involved legally somehow in 34 some odd countries. So really, we should have a more robust debate. We haven't been able to force a debate on whether or not we're at war for the last 7 years. I've been trying to get a vote on whether or not we are at war. We certainly appear to be at war. We're in Yemen, we're in Somalia, we're in Ethiopia, Djibouti, Niger, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. We're in a lot of different places, and yet the Senate has never voted on going to war. And you say, well, we're going after those people who attacked us on 9/11. Well, we killed those people. The people that we are now embattled with are sons and daughters of other people who might have the same ideology, but they're spread all across the world. We had a manned raid into Yemen not too long ago where we have not declared war. And when we had the manned raid, sadly, a Navy SEAL died and a bunch of people in the village died. And so we were told we got information to get the enemy. But you have to also look from the perspective of the people who live there. You say, oh, you would look from the perspective of our enemies? Well, no, you have to understand your adversary. You have to understand your enemy. You have to understand their response to it if you ever want to figure out a final solution or some kind of ending of a war. So you have to think about when the manned raid came at night with night vision goggles to a small village. Let's say the people were bad people. Let's say they were terrorists and someday might have come here. Well, we killed them, but we also killed their wives and their children too. And I don't fault our soldiers. Our soldiers go in the middle of the night and they're given a command. It's not their soldiers' fault. It's ours for having an unclear mission or for sending them into an impossible mission. There is no clear-cut war. There's 3 or 4 different factions fighting in Yemen. And here's the point I've been making. The neoconservatives are histrionic about, oh, Iran is supporting the Houthi rebels. Well, on the other side are Sunni extremists who are supported by Saudi Arabia, which also supports Sunni extremism across the world. But there's also a third party in Yemen that is Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. And my fear is that when you go in, you say, oh, the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, we must kill them, and we're going to support the Sunnis from Saudi Arabia. You have to ask yourself, well, what about Al-Qaeda? Do they get stronger or weaker? Here's my fear. We go into a civil war that nobody in America knows about, nobody can know up from down on, and we decide to get involved. What if the end result is chaos? What if out of that chaos arises Al-Qaeda? What if the end result of us getting involved in a civil war is they all kill each other, and we end up with a civil war in which Al-Qaeda becomes stronger?
Is there an objection to the request?
The interesting thing about it is, as you look at the war in Yemen, is that when you...
Is there objection to the request?
Yes, I object. So the
objection is heard.
So as you look at the war in Yemen and you go back and forth and you say, what are the results of getting involved in the civil war? It may well be that Al-Qaeda gets stronger. If you look at what happened in Syria, the neoconservatives, they went crazy and said, we should support the moderates in Syria that are fighting against Assad. Well, it turns out the moderates in Syria were Al-Qaeda linked, ISIS linked jihadists. In fact, one group that the neocons said we must give weapons to, turned out as soon as they got anti-tank weapons from us, they said, this was a quote from one of the leaders days after they got anti-tank weapons from us, they said, when we're done fighting Assad, not ISIS, Assad, we're going to attack Israel to take back the Golan Heights. We did this and we pumped millions of dollars and hundreds of tons of weapons into Syria, and it didn't work. And finally, actually, when we quit doing the funding and sending of weapons in, is when actually the Kurds rose up with our help and actually did a much better job. So the thing is that there's a perpetual war crowd who ignores the Constitution, and they will say we should be at war everywhere and we don't need to vote on it. One, that's a terrible insult to our forefathers and a terrible insult to the founding fathers. But as you look at this and you look at the debate, it's also incredibly draining to the Treasury and often has unintended consequences. So as we got involved in the Syrian civil war, the moderate, so-called moderates, many of them jihadists, many of them Al-Qaeda, the fiercest fighters actually were more Al-Qaeda linked, al-Nusra, they began pushing back on Assad, and you had sort of a chaos. Guess who arose in the chaos there? ISIS. So really, ISIS became a result of, or at least accentuated by our intervention in Syria. And then we had to go back in and fight ISIS. So here's the scenario that could happen in Yemen. We decide that we're going to go into Yemen and we're going to support the Sunni extremists that the Saudis are for against the Houthi extremists that Iran is for. But in the chaos, perhaps Al-Qaeda rises again, and we have to get more heavily involved. So I think there's no end to the sort of idea that we are going to kill a terrorist group in the middle of the desert in Yemen and that somehow there won't be more. I'll give you an example of how sometimes what we get involved with actually backfires and actually causes more terrorists to arise. So we've been feeding the Saudi planes bombs. We probably sold them the bombers as well, but we've been feeding the bombs. We've been helping them with targeting. And it turns out they've been targeting civilians. And so they targeted a funeral procession. The Saudi bombs that we gave them, we paid for, we gave them. They may have paid for them indirectly. But the Saudi bombs that are U.S. bombs, they ended up bombing in Yemen a funeral procession and killing about 150 people that were unarmed and wounding 500. And so you say, oh, well, I don't care what they think. I don't care what their response is. Well, think about what their response might be and then decide whether you care. And I'm not saying I'm sympathetic to the people. I don't know the people enough to be sympathetic or not, but I am aware of their response to being bombed in a funeral procession. My guess is that 1,000 years from now, that the people and their families will, through oral tradition, remember the bombing of the funeral procession. I'm not kidding you. I mean, these people have a long memory. The Sunnis and the Shia have been fighting for 1,000 years. They remember the massacre at Karbala. I promise you, they still celebrate it when one side massacred the other. And that was like, at least 500-600 years ago, maybe more. And so there's a long memory going on in this, and we have to decide whether it is more beneficial to kill one of them than it is to the result of having 10 new terrorists created by that. And the thing is, they're everywhere. And there's a branch of Islam that is radical and that does wish our demise and wishes harm. But we have to decide what the best way of containing this is, what's the best way of defending our country. And if you look at it, what I think you'll find is that there have been a great deal of unintended consequences. One, an enormous drain on the Treasury, but two, a lot of unintended consequences as far as sometimes it's actually made it worse. I think our intervention in Syria actually exacerbated the rise of ISIS. I think our intervention in Yemen could well exacerbate or cause or allow the rise of al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula again. It's confusing when you ask what do the soldiers want. The only soldiers that are allowed to speak are the ones at the very top or those who are retired. Even at the very top, most generals who are still active can't give a full opinion. They may give it to the administration, but typically not like on television or to the public. But the average soldier really is never asked for his or her opinion. And I understand that. I understand the role of the order of the military, and you have to take orders. But the interesting thing is, as you meet the average soldier, and I promise you this is true, and if people were able to do this and we were able to actually take a poll of thousands and thousands of ordinary soldiers, I think if you ask them, do we still have a purpose in Afghanistan? Are you ready for another deployment? You've been on 6 deployments to Afghanistan. Are you excited about the next deployment because freedom is going to ring out in Afghanistan? They're going to be a great self-sufficient country, and we will have won the war. I think most of the soldiers who have been there will actually tell you the opposite. And I've met dozens and dozens and dozens of these soldiers who have come home and actually are unclear now what our motives are. They're unclear what our goal is. They're unclear what the end result is. We had 2 undersecretaries recently into the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. One was Undersecretary of Defense and another Undersecretary of State. And so one of the senators asked them, how many Taliban are they? How many people are we fighting? Seems like a pretty honest question. And he said, you don't have to tell me the exact number, tell me about how many we're fighting. Neither one of them knew. They said, we have to wait till fighting season, then we'll find out. Well, anytime you're in a situation where there is a fighting season, and every year there is a fighting season, that maybe indicates maybe this is a perpetual war that's not going to end. But neither of these guys know. Is there 100,000 Taliban? Is there 10,000 Taliban? Interestingly, for the neocons who think this is going to sort of end like Hiroshima or Nagasaki and there'll be unconditional surrender, it will never end that way. So even Secretary Mattis, when I've asked him, will there ultimately be negotiation with the Taliban? He says actually there will be. The Undersecretary of the Department of Defense in our meeting said that the goal is to push them towards negotiation. But here's the interesting thing about Afghanistan. We've had as many as 100,000 troops. President Obama, who ran on a message of having less war and less involvement and was mercilessly criticized by the Republican side, actually escalated the war in Afghanistan to a great degree. So President Obama puts 100,000 troops into Afghanistan, and what happens? The enemy melted away. I'm sure we killed some, we won some battles, but they sort of melted away into our good ally Pakistan for the most part. But then they come back. And people say, we left too early. Well, how long are we going to stay? Are we going to stay forever? So we put 100,000 troops in, and it temporarily pacifies Afghanistan. So as we brought the troops down, now Taliban control maybe a third, some say maybe half of the territory. And you say, well, if we leave, the Taliban will take over. Well, how long is it going to take till the Afghans step up and fight for themselves? You know, one of the biggest problems we've had is actually infiltration of the Afghan army and them actually shooting us on the base. Now, it's ostensibly not the soldiers, it's people from the enemy that have infiltrated. But at the same time, there's been such enormous corruption in there. When Karzai ruled Afghanistan, his brother was accused of being in the drug trade. My good friend Thomas Massey from the House of Representatives often says, we spent $8 billion eradicating their poppy crop. You know, that poppy's the plant they make heroin out of. They had their best crop last year. So something's not working. And he often comments that for $8 billion, he could buy a lot of Roundup and probably do a better job. But the thing is that we aren't doing a very good job. The mission doesn't seem to have the purpose that it once had. And look, if I would have been here, I would have voted to go there after 9/11. We needed to disrupt the terrorist networks. We needed to punish them. And we needed to make sure they couldn't attack us again. So it was a noble endeavor. But there has to be an end. So when we say that, I think part of our problem is we're unsure how to define victory, so we never can have it. You know, there was a proposal to have a big military parade, and many of my friends who have served in the military were, a little bit worried about that because the image has been somewhat an image we've seen more in, totalitarian governments than in our own. We really haven't had a habit of it. But I was looking at a story and it said we did have a big parade after we won the first Iraq War, and the troops did parade through. And I'm not, completely against having a parade necessarily, but my suggestion was this. Why don't we bring the 14,000 troops home from Afghanistan, declare victory, and have a parade? Because then there really would be something to celebrate, bringing those 14,000 troops home. I think if we were involved in less war, we could pay our troops better. We have an enormous amount of veterans retiring from 15, 16 years. We've never been at war constantly for 16 years. And so we have a lot of veterans have been wounded. And so to take care of them is going to take enormous resources, and all of us want to provide those resources. But the thing is if we continue in sort of this perpetual war mode, are we eventually going to run out of money where we can't even take care of our own veterans? And so really what we're looking at tonight is we're looking at $1 trillion deficit. And I do think that deficit really, it does threaten our national security. I think our foreign policy threatens our national security in the sense that there are things that we need to upgrade. We need to take care of our nuclear arsenal. We need to take care of our bombers. We need to have the most modern planes and technology, but we often can't have it because we're involved in so many wars. People talk about the Romans getting overextended. We're everywhere, and we always think somehow it's our responsibility to take care of everything. And I think that in many parts of the world, particularly in Afghanistan, they see, they've been, since Genghis Khan, people have been going across Afghanistan, conquering it and going back across it, and then somebody new comes. But each time, the indigenous people have been strong enough to sort of ward off and eventually get rid of their attackers. Their attackers wore out. And it's sort of the same way now. Some of the people like us being there. Some of them have been honest, upright, good people. Some have been crooks. Karzai and his family were involved in the drug trade. The other problem is this, and this is a real problem that the other side fails to acknowledge, is Afghanistan is not really a country. Afghanistan is an area of Central Asia that Westerners drew a line around in the late teens or 20s. It may have been 1922. So that we draw this line around Afghanistan, we call it a country, but it's not really a country. The far western part speaks, Farsi, or is related in many ways more to the Iranian people and has more in common. The northern tribes have in common with the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, and different nationalities to the north. The Pashtuns sort of are on both sides of the Pakistan border. But if you ask any of these disparate people who their allegiance is to, they'll tell you that primarily their allegiance is to their local either warlord or local elders or local council, but they didn't have much allegiance to Kabul and never really have. They've never really seen themselves as subservient to the capital. So when we go there and we say, well, we're going to create a nation, it really isn't a nation that can be created because there really are people that may not want to be part of a nation. Iraq has a little bit of the same thing. You have the Sunni Shia split that is 1,000 years old, and then you've got the Kurds as well. And you've got a people that aren't necessarily that comfortable under the yoke of one country. And so as we try to force them in together and try to have them dominate, what you've kind of found in a lot of these areas is that you end up having a strong man, and the strong man rules with an iron fist. This was Saddam Hussein, who none of us have any love for. But the interesting thing about world politics and balance of power is that when we went in and toppled Saddam Hussein, let freedom ring, we actually made it more difficult for us in the world and made the Middle East more unstable. Because, see, Iran and Iraq had fought a fierce 8-year war, a very bloody war, and had come to somewhat of a standstill. But Saddam Hussein, for all his warts, was somewhat of a counterbalance to Iran. And so when Iraq is toppled and Saddam Hussein is gone, you once again have a power vacuum, and into that power vacuum, Al-Qaeda will fill, and did. And you upset the balance of power, between Iran and Iraq, and now Iran seems to be more threatening throughout the region. So as we look at our spending, without question, there is part of the spending that isn't in this bill, the mandatory spending. But for those who say, oh, we're not going to do anything for the part of the bill we're actually voting on, and we're okay with a $1 trillion deficit, I think there is a sort of a litmus test, and it's a litmus test of hypocrisy. If they were against $1 trillion deficits for President Obama, why is it okay to be a Republican deficit of $1 trillion? I think there's no escaping the hypocrisy of that. I think there's no escaping also the dire warnings we heard. Almost all of the Republicans, I venture to say every Republican in the Senate, has made dire warnings about the debt and was critical of President Obama. I was one of them. But we need to be honest enough to look in the mirror at ourselves when we are in charge of all three branches of government. See, when the Republicans took over the House, they said, well, don't have too high of expectations. We only control 1/3 of the government, or 1/2 of 1/3 of the government. And then we took over the Senate, and they said, well, we still can't do anything because President Obama's there. Now we have a Republican president. I don't know what the excuse is going to be. Some say, well, we must govern. And if by govern they mean act like the other side and run up huge deficits, I guess that's not what I'm interested in as far as governing. Governing is about making tough choices. And I think what has happened in our country, because we basically have a printing press, a Federal Reserve that replenishes and pays our debts, buys our debt simply by creating money and then buying treasury bills with it, or treasury bonds, is that we have sort of a limitless notion of debt. And that's kind of what's been going on. We just keep adding to it, and we, to a large extent, haven't had a catastrophe. I think we were close in 2008, and some of that is related to accumulation of debt. I think you also will see some of that in the near future. There's an unsettling notion out there with the stock market having risen so fast, so far, so fast, that you're seeing this jittery notion out there. And there is the worry about interest rates. There's the worry that historically we've funded this massive debt at about a 2% interest. What happens if we get back to more normalized rates of interest? So I think this is an important debate. And it's important to get also back to the crux of the debate. What I've been arguing for tonight is that we have amendments. The most important job that Congress does is to pass spending bills. It's the most important thing we do and the most important oversight that we have. And if we're to do that oversight, we should have a debate. We should have amendments. But what we're looking at is a bill that was decided in secret. 700 pages were printed last night at midnight, released at midnight, and for the most part have not been read. And it's very easy not to have a full understanding of a bill that's 700 pages or nearly 700 pages that comes forward. But within the midst of this, we know a couple of things. That we've gotten rid of fiscal responsibility. There were spending caps put in place, to try to control spending. And actually for a couple years, 2011, 12, 13, we actually were seeing a slowdown in the rate of growth of spending. But you heard everybody squawking about this sequester. They're like, oh, the sequester is so bad. But the interesting thing about the sequester is it actually wasn't a cut in spending. It was a slowdown in the rate of spending, slow down in the rate of growth of spending. And if you looked at curves over a long period of time, actually the rate of growth, you still had growth. You still had government growing, but we slowed down the rate of growth. And as revenue was picking up, we actually were whittling away at least a little bit at the annual deficit. But then the cries came, and really actually mostly from my side. They said the military is being hollowed out. We have to have more military money. But the dirty little secret around here is you can only get more military money if you give the other side more welfare money. So we got military, got warfare and welfare. That's guns and butter. It's been going on a long time. And so we've spent a lot of money, and both sides have now agreed to do this. The leadership has agreed to do this. But in this spending bill, what you're going to have is a looting of the Treasury, basically. But both sides are really culpable. Both sides are somewhat equally responsible for this bill and for the debt that will ensue. But the real question has to be, I think most importantly for my side, if you were against President Obama's trillion-dollar debts, trillion-dollar deficits, why are you for trillion-dollar deficits when you just simply put a Republican name on it? And I think people are going to see through this. I think people will see, and you're already seeing some of the clips in the media putting forward the comments in 2010 and 11 about President Obama's debt. And these are comments coming from Republicans who are now for this bill. And as they say in some parts of the country, they got some explaining to do. And that's the question. I mean, are people going to look at this and say, my goodness, is everybody up there just a partisan politician that all they care about is party? And that the debt's bad when it's a Republican debt, but then it's not bad when it's a Republican. I mean, it's bad when it's a Democrat debt, and it's not bad when it's a Republican debt. That's sort of what we're facing. And so my recommendation is that we really look long and hard at this. And most of the senators will tell you, they say, this is the last one. I'm never voting for this again. These are terrible. This is a rotten way to run your government. I object to doing it this way, but I'm going to vote for this one because, I don't want the government to shut down. And while I don't want the government to shut down, I also don't want to keep it open if we're not going to reform it. So it's really damned if you do, damned if you don't. But we could have done better. We could have moved forward with a responsible spending package that had amendments that we could all offer on the floor, an open amendment process and a debate. But we chose not to go that way, and that's why we're here. Some will say, oh, you're responsible for this. It's all your fault. Well, if I'm responsible for drawing attention to the debt, so be it. Somebody has to do it. I didn't come up here to be part of somebody's club. I didn't come up here to be liked. I didn't come up here to just say, hey, guys, I want to be part of the club, so I'm going to always vote with whatever you tell me to do. I've often voted with Democrats. I've often voted with Republicans. I have bills, I probably have 24 bills that I've co-sponsored with Democrats, but I'm also seen as one of the most conservative members of the Senate. So I think there is a way you can have bipartisanship, but bipartisanship doesn't mean you have to give up on everything you believe in. And that's sort of what this spending bill is it's a bipartisan spending bill that gives up on everything that Republicans ostensibly believe in as far as deficit, debt, and spending. So I will vote against this bill. I will continue to advocate that if they want to vote earlier, they can vote earlier, as long as I get a vote on an amendment where we would have an open debate and an explicit vote that says, are you for or against breaking the spending caps that we put in place? Thank you, Mr. President.